Good afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this Canadian Association of the Club of Rome presentation entitled, What If Wolves Could Vote? We have the honor and privilege of having our friend and neighbor, Dr. Karen Shragg, come all the way from Minnesota by Zoom to join us here in Ottawa and the world to talk about our friends, the wolves. If you don't consider wolves a friend, I hope you do by the end of the presentation. And you might be inspired to watch a very wonderful video about the impact of wolves on Yellowstone Park, which shows how constructive and helpful they are in our ecosystem, of which we are just a part. I heard about Karen recently from about a discussion about a conference which was looking at wolves. It was a wolf symposium, but Karen was kicked out. So you are going to be hearing from somebody who has been silenced by those out there who don't want to hear the right thing. And because she dared to talk about the fact that because there's so many of us and our population is going up so quickly, both in the US and Canada, there's now no place for the wolves to live because they need a lot of space to do their important service in the ecosystem. So we are in luck. We are in a hero. We have a hero with us who has been silenced, and we're glad to have her talking today about wolves. And in particular, think it's wonderful that she's talking about this from the wolf's perspective. You know, I've certainly become a fan of trying to avoid the human-centric view of things. So without further ado, let's hear from Karen, who is now going to be a wolf wannabe, and she's going to be speaking for the wolves just like the Lorax spoke for the trees. Thanks, Karen. It's your show. Oh, by the way, I will be the host for the questions. Put your questions in, and I will be at the end directing calling out your name for the questions at the end. I'm looking forward to those good questions. Bye. All the best, Karen.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Kcor, for giving me a platform. As you heard, it's not so easy to talk about what's really threatening the wolves, but let's get into it. So I call this What If Wolves Could Vote? Part of this is poetic, but based on biology, based on science, you know, the ever diminishing science that we are the world. And the subtitle is Partisan Politics and the Future of Wildlife in North America. And I dedicate it in memory to Dave Foreman, a wild Dior who advocated for all wild creatures. Next. So wolves have suffered from the mythology that they are beasts, as in the Big Bad Wolf story, Little Red Riding Hood. Also, Prokofiev did his wonderful music for the Peter and the Wolf, you know, but that if you can think about Prokofiev and that eerie music of the wolf comes into the story. And that's really how we've been raised, that the wolf is the big bad wolf. Now, it's also not a pet, but we have to demythologize the wolf, and we have to come at it from the perspective of what happens in nature when you get rid of a predator. Next. So I live in Minnesota, and if you say Timberwolves, most people will think of our professional basketball team. I hear they're doing well, and if you tuned in to this program thinking I was going to talk about basketball, well, you can turn it off right now. We're talking about the four-legged kind, and we have a little over 2,600 of them in the state of Minnesota. Next. So in the 1800s, many of you know, there was a taming of the West, at least in the US. It was symbolized by the slaughtering and eradication of the wolf. They symbolized wilderness, and along with the native peoples that were here, along with our diseases that just slaughtered them, the wolves, it was seen as a victory when the nearly 250,000 wolves we estimate were here. We were down to like 300 wolves in the lower 48 by 1960. And today wolves are considered varmints in many of our Western states. I had a very big argument with a rancher from Montana just a couple weeks ago in Texas when I was down for EarthX. And I said, when you give something what they call predatory status in the West, you actually, it's this far away from being a varmint. In other words, if it has no value, why can't I just run it over with my snowmobile? And so that is kind of the current thing that's going on, is we're nowhere near where we were before Europeans got to our shores. Next. So let me help you fall in love with wolves the way I have. And I do think we need some of that, what are you going to call it? The kind of way we want to just do a little bit overboard to the love, so that we quit really annihilating the species that has really done so well at surviving in spite of us. Next. So they're just an amazing species. You can't hate wolves if you love dogs, and because they descend only from the wolf. They do not descend from coyotes or foxes. And if you around dogs a lot, dogs are very social. They have organization about them, and that comes from the wolf. They do have an alpha, but not the way we think of alphas. They don't fight for that position. An alpha is more of the one in charge. The studies that were originally done were done with wolves in captivity, but in the wild, the wolves, they take care of their elderly and feed them when they can't hunt anymore. They share in the taking care of their young. They're excellent group hunters, although they're not as good of hunters as we think they are. They're very cunning and determined. And what's so cool is they each have their own call. Not like birds, where like all cardinals sound the same, for example, but each individual wolf has its own call, just like a singer in a band would have its own voice. Next. So some of their natural history, I won't get into all of it. This is really about the biology, but it's really important to understand what Canis lupus is to the world. One of my favorite things is how far they can hear and smell an enemy or their members of their own pack. In their olfactory cells in their noses, they can actually determine gender just in the smell, and they don't wear perfume. So it's pretty cool. They're feast or famine eaters, meaning if they could just down 20 pounds of meat from a kill, and then go for 12 days without eating again. So they really are designed to be a hunter, which means they're not always going to be successful, and they'll be able to survive through that. Next. So as we mentioned, in early America, there were bounties on wolves, and so millions of wolves had to die so the wilderness could be tamed. And people had that same idea about native people and native lands. It's just so important to realize that what we thought, what our story was at the beginning of this country, not only was wrong, but continues in some form today, especially in the West of the United States. Next. So wolves aren't only apex predators at the top of the food chain, they're also considered a keystone species. Now, if you remember the old archways in Europe, the middle stone on top of the arch was called the keystone. What happens if we remove that middle stone? The whole arch falls apart. And that's what wolves are. And it took us a really long time to figure that out here in the US, especially in Yellowstone. I'll be talking about that in a little bit. But in Yellowstone, there's a book, if you've never read it, it's called Playing God in Yellowstone by Cook. And what he says was they removed all the predators intentionally. This is the National Park Service. And didn't realize what havoc that would cause, because what happened was the elk went to 20 to 30,000. They started eating all the willows, all of the young aspen trees, which served to feed beavers and so many other animals. When they reintroduced the wolf, especially to the northern part of the park, what happened was the elk went down, the trees came up, the beavers came back. It's called a eutrophic cascade. And that is what happened to Yellowstone. Now think of the world when you remove that kind of predator, you have this really deflation of the biodiversity, which is something we don't want to happen, because we're part of that. We're part of the ecosystem of the world, although we pretend in our cement buildings that we're not. So if you look at Yellowstone as an experiment and what happens when you remove the wolf and what happens when you put it back in, you realize how important they are. They're critically important to the world we live in. Next. So just imagine if wolves could vote to protect their own future. Which side of the political aisle would they choose to represent their interests? Now we're, oh my goodness, right in the middle of a horrific bipartisan, no, the opposite of bipartisan. It's a very partisan fight for the political reins of this country. And I just dawned on me that what if wolves could vote? Who would they vote for? Which side of the aisle would protect them the most? So that's what we're going to explore from now on. Next. Remember, wolves have no party loyalty. A lot of people say, well, I'm going to vote for this party because that's what my grandfathers voted for and their grandparents before them. But when wolves vote, they're not going to be thinking about anything else. They're not going to be thinking about abortion rights or any of that. They'll be considering only one thing, their future. And they're fighting two issues: the ramifications of human population growth and overpopulation, and varmint status. Those two things work against them. Next. So, first of all, what did wolves mean to Native peoples historically and in present day America? In most Native cultures, the wolf is considered a medicine being. Now, think of that and put that next to I don't know if you all heard about, but in Wyoming, there's a case where somebody took a young female wolf, injured her in a snowmobile, brought it into a bar, and killed it inside the bar. Okay, and just think about the difference between that and being a medicine being associated with courage and strength and loyalty and success at hunting. It's a common clan animal among the Creek, the Ojibwa, the Algonquin tribes. And so it's the very opposite of how we have treated the wolf. Is we have not seen it as a medicine being or as a animal from which to learn from. Next. So where did wolves live historically? Well, they lived everywhere. There we are. If you look at that slide, the Earth doesn't know the boundary between Canada and the US and Alaska and everything. It's just where the wolves used to be. And these are wolves that, you're talking about different species. I read earlier today that out of about 26 original species, we only have 2 remaining, and all the subspecies that are alive in the world come from those 2 remaining species of wolves. So we have them in parts of Alaska, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Idaho, Montana, a little bit in Oregon, a little bit in Arizona, which is reintroduced, and New Mexico. And they are found, as many of you know, throughout Canada. Next. So what do wolves need to survive? Well, they need lots of open space with no interfering development. Okay, they need plenty of prey and shelter, and they need water that's unpolluted. They need animals to eat free from toxins, and they need protection from hunting, trapping, and yes, some wolves are still poisoned. Next. So over time, things have changed politically for the wolves. Both parties in the US have been both good and bad over the years. Let's take a look. Next. So the platforms of the parties in the US have drastically changed over the years. The Republican Party platform of today, and yes, I had to go through and read all these things. They believe in liberty and economic prosperity, preserving American values, whatever that means, and restoring the American dream for every citizen, but they have no statement about wildlife or even conservation, even on their platform. Next. 122 years ago, the 26th president of the US was a Republican, and he was known as the Great Conservationist. Theodore or Teddy Roosevelt established 230 million acres of public lands between 1901 and 1909. That was very fast. And he included 150 national forests. He preserved the first 55 federal bird reservations and game preserves, 5 national parks, and the first 18 national monuments. And many of these became protective spaces for the wolves. Next. However, wolves wouldn't have voted for Teddy Roosevelt because he declared the wolf the beast of waste and desolation and called for its complete eradication. So here you have the most conservation-minded Republican US president calling for the annihilation of wolves. That just shows you how even in the mindset of someone who really understood why nature needed to be conserved, that wolves still couldn't pierce that bubble. Wolves were still shot, trapped, poisoned, tortured, and burned alive, and it was encouraged by the federal government. Next. So today, dismantling of the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, by gutting its budget, it was on Trump's, who's the Republican candidate, Donald Trump's agenda last time around, and it remains so as far as we can tell. Wolf and climate protections have also been slated to be slashed. Remember, wolves are going to be subject to climate changes just like all of us are. Next. So the Democratic Party platform of today has only one reference to the environment, and it was 91 pages long that I had to wade through. And there is no discussion about protecting land for wildlife by limiting development or growth of our population. Still, Democrats tend to propose wildlife protection legislation instead of removing protections. Next. The policies which wolves would be in favor of would include stop issuing logging permits, stop issuing mining permits, and ones, of course, that stop hunting, trapping, and poisoning them to get rid of their predator status, which is a political name that allows them to be killed without any rules. Next. But the future and fitness of the wolf population is definitely tied to our own. Globally and locally, human overpopulation is pushing the limits of our biodiversity, driving our most iconic wild animals toward extinction because they need what I talked about. They need lots of open land that's not developed. Since the first day of Earth Day in 1970, we've now celebrated 54 of them. The global human population has increased from 3.7 billion to now over 8 billion. And that is a global picture of what is happening to all of the top predators that aren't humans. Next. So what happens when you have more people? You get more roads. And then if you have more roads, you have less wildlife. So what happens when you have more roads? You have habitat fragmentation, you have mortality in the form of roadkill, you have pollution from car and truck exhaust, and you have blocked access to reaching young and water during times of drought. So if there's a drought going on, or even if it isn't, and a new road is built, and there's a den on one side of the freeway, and you have to go hunt for your prey on the other side, you may not make it back because a road has gone up or a fence has gone up. I know there's been a good effort to make these freeways accessible underneath and overpasses, but in general, more people, more roads equal less wildlife. Next. So did any US president try to address population growth? Yes. The only one to establish the Commission on Population Growth and the fear of what it would mean for the country's prosperity was, if you click it again, you should see his face. There you go. Richard Milhous Nixon, who we love to hate because of his policies on the Vietnam War, but he actually passed some of the best legislation for the wolves during his presidency. And he had a commission that was started to show how population was a negative impact on on the U.S. Those of you, I don't have to get into it now, know that the League of Bishops told him that if he wanted to get reelected, he couldn't talk about overpopulation and its impact, its negative impact. He helped establish the Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, and he was a Republican. So I want to give sort of the overall picture that the politics towards the wolves has changed. The party platforms have changed over time in the U.S. Next. Now, Canada, those of you who are from our neighbor to the north, has the second largest wolf population in the world, Russia being the first. Now, these aren't all the same species, but they're wolves. And Russia has the most, being 300,000. The estimated population in Canada is between 50 and 60,000. About 15,000 of them live in BC and Alberta. And wolves are currently in 90% of the original range of Canada. In Alberta, wolves can still be hunted in season and killed on private property if they threaten domestic animals. And BC also allows wolf hunting and culling. And so, yes, the more land you have, the more wolves you will have, and the less you have to protect. Okay. So what political parties favor wolves in Canada? Well, Canada has a more parliamentary system with more political parties. I just found the one that actually had something about unsustainability of mass immigration, which is why Canada is mostly growing now, and that would be the People's Party. They understand that puts pressure to develop on or near wolf habitat, which would increase not only the ecological footprint of Canada, but also push wolves into developed areas. Now, what's really important to know is that any increase in population causes people to either build up or build out. And neither is good for the environment, neither is good for sustainability. As you know, most of the people live on around the border of the US because that's the most livable place to be. And the wolves live in more of the tundra area. But still, you have that pressure that goes on toward the wolves. And as those conflicts still will increase. So like I said, the People's Party was the only party, although they don't have any representation and they're not in power. At least it's on their platform. I thought that was pretty cool. Next. So if wolf could vote in either country, what would they be seeking in their candidate? Looking out for their interests. No hunting, no poisoning, no growth. And we have to remember that the World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet report in 2022 reported that globally wildlife populations have plummeted by 69% on average. That means even more than that in some countries and in some areas. So if that's what's happening with wildlife, we know that we are to blame. We have to say the word overpopulation with a capital O, because there's so many euphemisms for overpopulation. There's human infringement, there's development, but really is just too many people, because we are also apex predators and cannot move ourselves down from that enough to make a difference when there are 8.1 billion of us on the planet. I like to say that my father, who just passed last year, was born in 1926, and 6 billion humans were added just during one person's lifetime. And I think of that, and it's just so overwhelming, but it is the energy behind all of this decimation of wildlife. And until we name it, until we blame it, we cannot fix it. Too many people jump to solutions which they see as draconian, but what's draconian is the actual fact that we think that there are no limits to our growth and that the planet can handle all of our demands without harming wildlife. Next. So in the US, legislation that has been helpful to the wolves was signed into law with bipartisan efforts. Both sides of the aisle came together to pass the Wilderness Act, the Clean Air Act, the establishment of the EPA, and the Endangered Species Act. All of those were considered to be a breath of fresh air at their time. Next. So as an example, the Endangered Species Act was put into place by a Democrat from Michigan, John Dingell, and Senator Harrison Williams, a Democrat from New Jersey. But President Nixon, with a capital R after his name, signed it into legislation in 1973. And it passed unanimously in the Senate by a vote of 355 to 4. I wonder if that could pass on something like today. And the gray wolf was one of the first species listed under the Endangered Species Act. Next. The laws preventing wolves from being classified as a predator, which gives them varmint status, needs to be considered. Attacks on livestock have become a call for their control, and they're relatively rare. I recently found out from the biologist who works on Ted Turner's property in Montana that there have been counted 50 kills of livestock by wolves, but that's on cattle particularly, but that's out of 2 million head. And that's a pretty small, actually a fraction of the amount. But there are things with a modicum of effort we can do to help those ranchers not sustain those losses. You can do, if you have to do lethal control at the very last minute, you could do that if you can prove that that's really what's going on. But there are any number of things that can be done. Higher fences to protect cattle. There can be better sheep herding dogs. There can be paying of the, say, what's the value of your cow? The value is $600, whatever that is. You pay them for the loss of their animal rather than killing the wolf. There are many things that can be done to coexist where wolves and ranchers exist. But that goes back to overpopulation, because the more people we have, the more mouths there are to feed, the more ranchers we need, and you're going to have that conflict of raising food on the hoof and predators. Next. So as you can see from the slide, it says wolves can't live here. I really wouldn't want to live there either. But the most effective laws protecting the wolves limit population growth in our already overpopulated countries. By 2060, the Census Bureau projects that the US population will have grown from 336 million, what it is today, to approximately 444 million Americans. And this growth is mostly due to mass immigration, which drives the loss of open space and habitat for wolves and other species. That's just a fact. And the minute you mention immigration, people think, oh, you must hate immigrants. But that is ridiculous. I can drive a car and love my car, but hate the fact that there are too many cars on the road because there's too much overpopulation. So we can't keep conflating those two things. Immigrants themselves each have a powerful story to tell, but mass immigration is something that diminishes life in both of our countries because we're out of room. Next. So Canada has the same population problem as the US because as your population grows, wolves suffer. International migration continues to be the main source of Canada's population growth. And in the third quarter of 2023, the vast majority of the population growth was due to international migration. So as you can see on the slide there, where the population of Canada is, it's in the lower part, but that is the part where people can actually live. I don't know how many of you can live in how cold it is there, but that's another story. Next. So population growth is bad for the wolf. It's bad for your traffic. We know it's bad for your housing situation. It's bad for your economy. It's bad for being able to provide everyone with health care. It's bad for a lot of things. But of course, we're focusing on the wolf today. It spurs sprawl. Sprawl pushes wolves out of their territory. And if they remain there, there are conflicts. Next. So Democrats in the US, although they are better on legislative protections for the wolf, have repeatedly refused to come to the table on limiting growth through immigration, where most of the US population growth is coming from. They have a record of framing social justice for fellow humans as more important than sustainability and wildlife. They want to continue mass immigration to continue when we are already living so far beyond our carrying capacity. I like to say that it takes about 82 gallons of water a day to just keep one person going. And that includes all the processing of water that we need for our lives. And then we know that due to climate change, our water resources are going down, our aquifers are going down, there are rivers that don't run all the way to the sea, and yet you want to add more people who can't stop using water. Yes, we could stop driving limos. Yes, we could stop flying in private planes. We could do a lot of things that would be better for the planet. But water, to me, is one of the factors we must look at when we look at encouraging growth. So it's become a wedge issue, and it's been weaponized to win votes instead of helping wolves. Next. So it's a mixed bag. What Republicans have been offering of late is varmint status. Wolves would not vote for those on the Republican side of the aisle because they want to keep them, they don't want to keep them on the endangered species list. They don't want to protect them from hunters, logging, and mining. Democrats offer a bad record of increasing the US population by permitting more growth, as I mentioned. And immigration can't help but destroy more habitat as we sprawl from our center cities out into land that would be otherwise for wolves and other animals. Next. So rewilding is a big concept that's been going on in our country. We have the Rewilding Institute, which I mentioned Dave Foreman as the person who started that, and it continues as in his memory. But it's really only possible if we put the brakes on growth. We have another idea out there, 30 by 30, so 30% of wilderness saved by 2030. Nature needs half, something that E.O. Wilson started. We have the Wildlands Project. We have getting some success and traction on removing dams and fences and creating wildlife corridors. All those things are great efforts, but they will be only undermined if we just keep allowing population growth to continue, which is really stoppable by reasonable legislation. Next. So what happened when all these legislations that I mentioned that the US has passed in the 60s and beyond is that the US population was, and Canada's too, was significantly less when most of the wildlife legislation was passed, which is really interesting because the more people we've had in the countries, the less legislation it seems that we're able to use as protection. It seems like it's just backwards. Next. So conservation can't work with a growing population. It can only work in little pockets here and there. We can save a prairie here, and we have organizations like the Nature Conservancy that will trade land and offer the most legislative protection. But a growing population increases everything, not only roads, but air traffic and pollution and everything that works against wildlife. So we really need to see these two issues as something that we really should conflate. Next. So what we've done is we've gone from disrespect to conservation to what I call environmental lip service, because you can't say you're for the wolves if you're also for growth. And they have suffered under policies which have treated them as the enemy of progress, and expansion is really their enemy. It's our enemy too. They got some reprieve under conservation policies, but they now suffer what I call environmental lip service, because you can't say you love wildlife when you also embrace growth. Next. So when we work to protect the wolves, we work to protect ourselves in both of our countries. What gets better with less population growth? We get less traffic, less pressure on water usage, less pressure on infrastructure, less need for housing, less homelessness, and safer cities. Next. And we get more open space, and that's what wolves and need, along with a lot of other big predators. So immigration policy and lack of enforcement of current laws have become an issue in this US election. It's been politicized on both sides of the aisle. Pressure to do something about the failed policies are inflaming our political climate, but no one seems to really have a handle on how best to proceed. I think partly because it's not framed as a sustainability issue. Because people look at it as a hate issue, people look at it as a love issue. It really is more and should be more on the sustainability plate. If you can't sustain this growth, then you have to figure out ways to stop the growth. And it's coming from just a place of common sense, really. Next. So in the US, we've had ways to curb migration already on the books, already legal, but it doesn't matter if you have laws if people look the other way and don't enforce them. It needs bipartisan support, but it has to advocate for a deep understanding of saying, like my friend Alon Tal wrote a book called Israel, the Land is Full, and America, the land is full, Canada, the land is full. I think it's going to be harder to sell that to other people when you see these vast open countries, but it's not farmland that's vast, it's tundra that's vast, and that's nothing that can support us. So we have to look at this idea that it is okay, like it is in many countries, to say, time out, you can come in, but you have to leave. So you have to enforce visas when they aren't allowed. We have an e-verify system, which is electronically looking at whether people have legal status so they can actually have a job and maybe what their visa allows them to stay, and then make sure they leave at the end of their visa. We have something called the HR2 policy, which is Secure the Border Act, a legislation that keeps knocking on the door of the legislature to get passed. We have to end chain migration, which says you got in, now you can bring in your relatives, depending on how far down that goes. Visa lotteries, they allow in thousands, tens of thousands of people just by picking your name randomly, literally out of a hat. All those things encourage growth. And yes, we all understand the personal stories of people wanting to move to our countries, but we also have to be the tough love of saying, when we do that, we diminish our own resources, our own countries, and we have a right to protect those borders without hatred and without some of the nefarious things that some people are spewing. Next. So Canada's immigration is set, last time I checked, it was about 500,000 a year. That's way too many for what you're already facing in terms of trying to find enough resources for the people already there. It's not as subject to illegal immigration as we are. So many people are now flowing through our borders in Texas and Arizona, but it's still too high for the future of wolves, still way too high, because you have to look at when people start suffering because there aren't enough housing and housing prices go up and you have more, you have to say, wait a minute, what are we doing wrong? And if people are suffering because of overpopulation, you know the wolves are as well. Next. In truth, wolves would leave the voting booth in both the US and Canada with no boxes checked, for their best leader has not yet emerged, one that both understands and advocates for limits to mass immigration, and one that advocates for their protections. Next. That's my favorite slide. I wish I could have done it better. There's wolves kind of trying to leave the voting booth. As it stands today, wolves need better choices in the voting booth. Conflicts with wolves will intensify as the US and Canada population grows. And I would say we need better choices in the voting booth as well. So David Brower, who former president of many things, including the Sierra Club, said you don't have a conservation policy unless you have a population policy. And remember, conservation isn't just for the wolf, it's for us as well. Next. Curbing population growth must be framed as a liberal, traditionally liberal issue in that traditional sense of the world. In other words, when you take care of the wolves, you take care of people, the people who are living here, trying to live here, and our impact, whether we're in tightly packed cities or living more in suburbs or in rural areas, we all take up lots of land for the food that we need, for the resources that we need. So when we keep our population low, we actually keep our future brighter. Next. Well, that's it. Thank you for having me speak today. You can contact me at www.movingupstream.com. I look forward to your questions now and for you contacting me sometime in the future.
You're muted, Gordon. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for doing that. Thank you very much, Karen. You were as hard-hitting as I hoped you would be. It was very interesting hearing your quote from the People's Party. You're clearly not a Canadian when you did that. There's people here, and I can guarantee there are people here in the audience who are going, "Oh my gosh!" But
they just mentioned it. I'm not telling you to vote for them.
No, I know, but it's very odd that a party that is by far the most right wing in Canada and libertarian, they're very libertarian, actually, and that they would have that policy. It's very odd.
It isn't, because that's true in our country too. The Republicans are the ones who will jump on board of mass immigration. It's usually for the wrong reason, though. That's the problem.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Anyway, so my question, I'm the questioner, so I get to ask the first question is,
good.
I've been with the Greens as a candidate for like 15 plus years. And whenever I would raise something about growth not actually being a great God to worship, I lost votes. Like, you guarantee it's a turnoff, like it's a guaranteed shoot me in the head kind of thing. So it's a question of, I'm just wondering, I tried to do it like in multiple elections in different ways, and whatever way I said it was, a vote loser. And I've come to the conclusion it's just a matter of waiting until it's so bad that people go, "Oh my gosh, maybe you're right after all." Do you have an alternative to waiting until it's so bad that people finally smell the rose, wake up and notice when everything else is dying, it eventually basically hurts us too, right?
Well, I had a similar experience. I was suggested I get on my city's sustainability committee, and they wanted to talk about recycling and composting. And I said, I want to talk about growth. Because when I moved here, we had 89,000 people in my city suburb, and now we have 92,000. And I said, that's just not sustainable. And I showed graphs of water supply and so on. And I wasn't even allowed to get on the committee. And it was a sustainability committee. So I don't think it's a Greens thing. I don't think it's sustainable. I think it's a story that we're not telling well enough. That's why I chose to talk through the eyes of a wolf, that maybe that would pierce the main story, which is humans aren't bad. We just have to do things better. In other words, I call it the tinkering perspective. We can tinker. We can wash out our peanut butter jars and things will get better. Whereas it's just us and our presence and our numbers that is the problem. I think to get over that hurdle, we're going to need religious leaders to come in a room and say, look, you can't just keep wanting more people in your pews. The world doesn't have enough space in its pews. I think that's what's really behind it, is this inability to see a very different story, which is an ecological story. We're not taught ecology. We're not taught nutrition. We're not taught anything in our school systems. And I can't speak for the Canadian school systems, but correct me if I'm wrong, that really gives the homage to ecology that we need to understand. And that if you transgress nature's rules, nature will come back with such a vengeance that some of the things that I'm suggesting to deal with mass immigration will seem like child's play, because it will just collapse on itself and probably will anyway, but what I'm saying is that to not recognize the real enemy is us, as they say. So I just see that we just have to keep telling better stories, and we can't amplify their stories. I don't know if you're familiar with George Lakoff, who wrote "Don't Think of an Elephant," but so many times I see this all over social media, although I try not to be on it too much. They'll tell somebody's story, and then they'll say, "But look, that's not true. Look at what they said. Look how bad they are." And all we do is we amplify their stories. We have to tell a new story and say, "You're not green if you're not dealing with growth. Call yourself brown, call yourself whatever you want, but don't call yourself green and think it's environmental." So we have to just say, we have to really make our story more powerful, because it's really the only story that nature is telling. The people who are not letting you say growth is bad are people who really don't understand nature at all. And I would question why they're even a part of the party.
Thank you very much. You're still hopeful in spite of everything that's happened to you and going in. So congratulations on that.
I don't know if I'm hopeful. I'm just not going to let it bother me.
The first question will come from Richard, and then on deck is Claude. So first Richard, then Claude.
Okay, thank you. I just have a question. It's very straightforward. You know, how does the crossbreeding of coyotes and wolves, how does that affect the population? How does that affect their behavior? And how would that affect your thinking?
Well, the crossbreeding of wolves and coyotes has produced something called the Kai wolf. The Kai wolf is something that is, we're still studying it. It's become its own thing. In other words, they're a little more aggressive, and they're a little more, they don't have the benefits of the wolves, but they have the ability to operate alone and be more aggressive. I think when we have conflicts, and with a Kai wolf, let's say, that is threatening a neighborhood, of course, lethal answers have a role to play. What I'm really getting at is this overall attitude that wolves are bad and that we have to annihilate them. That's where we started. I think we have to take it on a case-by-case basis and say, we have a Kai wolf in our area. It's eaten 12 dogs, 5 cats, and 3 rabbits. Got to do something at that point. So that's really not even what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the pressure of population growth on open lands that is, using the wolf more as a metaphor, that is going to be a problem, because that's just part of evolution. Evolution's going to have these animals, and I think that the other part that's a problem, and I'm really glad for the question, is when I managed a nature center, we went from 3 to 48 deer in about 9 years, and we had to do something. We had to do a lethal answer, because we didn't have wolves that would come in. So it doesn't matter really the species. It just matters when they get out of balance, we have to interfere. And I don't think there's any difference between that and the Kai wolf.
I was going to add that, the comment that you have about immigration, I think you'd be careful, at least from my point of view, because you also get brain gain when you have immigration. And I wouldn't
say it again. You get what?
You get brain gain. In other words, you get intellectual ability that's brought into the country. There are people with highly trained and professionals and so forth that we desperately need, that have been trained elsewhere, that can be licensed and so forth in your own country or our country, and will perform. For instance, in our country, we're desperately short of physicians. And, there are trained physicians already in other countries that can provide some of the vacuum of physicians that we have here.
Oh, there are a number of different things that can be solved with immigration. But I think overall, there's more loss. And so let me see how we could solve that particular problem. What is the reason that Canadians aren't going into medical school? Is it a cost issue? Is it an interest issue? Is it they're not being paid enough issue? So in other words, if you're a Sri Lankan doctor and you you're going to be paid more in Canada's system than you are in Sri Lanka. There's an incentive to come here. So there could be some economic reasons why you don't have, but I think you have to, if you look at Canada as full and you go, God, but we have a doctor shortage. How do you deal with the doctor shortage in a more organic way? Do doctors need to be paid more? I don't know. I'm just asking the questions. I'm just saying that you could also have what I call revolving door immigration, which means we're going to bring you in for a limited amount of time, and during that 7 years you're here, we're going to have you train doctors. How can we benefit from your training and lower the cost of medical school for those who can't afford medical school? So a revolving door immigration would mean that you wouldn't gain any long-term growth from that. So I think there are some other answers, and I know that one of the things that's brought up a lot is what do you do for the agriculture industry, where people are brought in at least seasonally to come in and pick crops. That all these issues are real and important, but what doesn't ever seem to be on the plate is continued perpetual growth in a limited environment. And if we can't sustain that, then I think some of our policies, advocacies, and enforcements will help to keep things sort of like this rather than just going crazy. I mean, we've added in the last, I think 4 years, about 3.8 million people per year. So round that up, that doesn't even include guest migrants, the guest workers. So that doesn't even, so let's round it up to 4 million. 4 times 4, 16 million people all coming to the US for things that have been considered a need. But what does 16 million people do to habitat, to traffic, to water demand? It really pushes us over the demand edge. So I think we are creative enough to say, look, we have a doctor shortage in Canada. Let's put our heads together and figure out what's behind that. And is it an aging population that needs more doctors as you get older and it just hasn't been able to keep up? There's all kinds of reasons that could happen. Could we do an exchange program between the US and Canada where we share a border with you? Maybe I mean, I know we have an issue in our state with not having enough doctors in rural areas. And I'm sure someone who's in an overcrowded country in India would love to come to a place that's not so crowded, as long as they wouldn't be subject to racism and so on. But maybe those exchange programs could happen in a sustainable way. So I don't want to diminish that there's issues about that, but I don't want to call it a benefit. I would want to call it a need. There's a need. Let's figure out that need without increasing our populations so far beyond its ability to sustain wolves and others. Good question.
Thank you very much. A good answer to a very typical response. What Richard said, that's a very typical Canadian perspective, which is the norm up here. And it's a subject of good topic for debate. Thank you for that conversation for the two of you. Next is Claude. Richard, if you could mute yourself now. And Claude, you're up, and Dave Doherty is on deck.
Yes, thank you for a very interesting talk. I also am in Minnesota, even though I'm a K-Corps member. My question really is going to be very unpopular in almost all circles. What does the United States and China owe climate migrants in light of the historic CO2 that is already in the atmosphere? 25% attributed to us when we were a major producer of things, and a lot of that industry was transferred over to China. So China is responsible for putting 25% of the CO2 in the atmosphere, which is the major greenhouse gas that is driving the move to higher latitudes. So from the wolves perspective, I will ask you to answer this question, because
Sure.
I see that uncontrolled migration is almost an inevitable outcome of the failure of policy over the last 50 years.
Well, lots to unpack there. First of all, I want to say that my understanding, the last time I looked, when you take a migrant from a low carbon country and move them here, they increase their footprint by 4 times what it was. Okay, so when they come here, you're adding to climate, because in their country, maybe they didn't have a microwave, maybe they didn't have a car, maybe they didn't have a 3-bedroom house or everything we consider normal in a middle class Canada or US home. So they're going to increase that. They also might have a culturally expected higher expectation for family size, so they're going to bring that with them as well. So now you're increasing carbon. There's another layer of it, that when we send our manufacturing to China because it's cheaper, and they use lots of coal over there, and they're adding to the atmosphere, and then we buy back those products. Now we're paying shipping containers and ships to bring them back to us so we can put them in our Dollar Tree stores and buy them cheaply. You know, globalization is really a tough one because, you know, where is the blame? You know, it is all about having a top predator, in wolves' terms, taking over. And the reason we've been able to take over is that long ago we discovered fire. And I don't mean that facetiously, because when our jaws were really, really big, we had to chew and chew and chew. We didn't have room for these brain cells. And when we invented fire, we didn't have to chew as much. We could actually have more room for brain cells. So we've been able to figure out a lot of things like nitrogen and growing and the green revolution and all the things we've been able to invent, which on one perspective are pretty amazing. I just saw a thing the other day that we've got a rover going around Mars telling us, mapping Mars right now. I mean, it is pretty amazing that we can do those things. That doesn't mean we can sustain it. That doesn't mean it's good, but it is amazing. All right. Amazing is kind of almost a neutral word. So from a wolf's perspective, I would say globally, and I don't know if the UN is the right place to do it. We all have to look at it. This is just one planet. China, Russia, whatever. They all have to come together and say, you can't ship your garbage somewhere else. You can't ship your carbon somewhere, because it's all being trapped in our atmosphere. And it's got to be a global conversation. And right now, the reason I focus on mass immigration is that it's really the only levers we can push to take care of our own country. If every country looked at their own resources and what is happening to them and then made their own laws. I mean, you found out right now, and this is what's going on in Madagascar, that the lemurs are being threatened because of population growth, because they're cutting down the forest to grow more corn, because their population is just going through the roof. And it's not because of immigration. It's because of just local growth on a small island. What would be your power to help that? You could write a letter, but your power isn't in Madagascar. Your power is in the US, or it's in Canada, wherever you live, to say to your legislatures, look, the world is unsustainable and we are unsustainable. We have to kind of come together. I mean, yes, immigration, you're right, is going to become more and more and more of a problem, because there's going to be oceans rising and people losing their homes because they're being flooded. And look what's going on in Brazil right now. I mean, but I guess what I want to add to the conversation is just taking in your 10,000, 50,000, a million people isn't an answer. For those individuals, for temporary, it might seem like one, but globally, it's not an answer.
What I'm hearing you say in very eloquent side arguments is that we don't owe them anything.
Well, owe them in what way?
I mean, you're asking us to, you know, what do we owe the wolves? We owe the wolves survival, even if we don't owe them high population at the moment. And thank God we have northern climates that they are still surviving, perhaps even thriving in certain areas. And yet I'm asking you, in that light, what do we owe the people that we caused their economies to go? Partly, some of it is just their growth, their inability to control their population as well. But what do we owe those people that are going to want to survive? They can't survive in their own countries.
I guess I think we owe our populations first. And we owe them.
So internally, do we owe the Minnesotans to keep those Texans out of Minnesota? You know that by constitutional law, we can't do that.
No, we can't. But
if we fragmented, we could.
But what we could do is focus on sustainability. So, for example, if you have a house and you have room for 5 people to come in, but 50 people want to come in, and you want to be nice, and what's going to happen to that house? You're going to run out of water. you run out of room, you're going to run out of sanitation. And I don't think it's being nice to let people into an already overpopulated place.
So that's the conundrum. And I thank you for
It is a
your
conundrum.
time,
It is
and I'll let you get on to other
Okay,
questions.
no, great question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed that very much. It's I think it's rare these days that we can have a civil conversation about these kinds of difficult issues. So congratulations to both of you for pulling that off. Much appreciated. Our next question comes from Dave Doherty, and William Reese is on deck.
Thank you, Gordon. Very interesting talk, Karen. In a way, I think you at least scratched at the surface of the answer to my question, but it seems particularly relevant in terms of the last conversation that you had. My question is this, it's actually several different questions. The first of which is long. What would the impacts be on the wolf if Canada's proposed century initiative is implemented, which would bring the human population here to 100 million by the year 2100 from the 40 million we have now? The two ancillary questions are, would we say goodbye to the wolves, and to which other species?
Well, first of all, I don't know where you're going to put 60 million people. I mean, that is just, I mean, you're just going to, are you going to just, I've been to China, and if they've got buildings that are 35, 50 stories high, because you can't put them up at the Northwest Territories. There's just not enough. I mean, the tundra is melting. Okay, so let's just assume that that horrible plan, whoever came up with that, is going to be in play. I think you will find in your particular biome, you will find that the wolves will still be probably surviving, depends what climate change does to the tundra, in the very northern range of your country. And I think in any other country, it would just annihilate almost every other species, including most of the ungulates, most of the smaller, medium-sized predators, the weasels and the raccoons and so on, because human population growth beyond its capacity ends up having this terrible cascade on everything else. Water demand, water quality, I've mentioned, energy, you know. Let's just say that you find that that there's tremendous amount of oil shale in the Northwest Territories that now it becomes economically viable to mine, because you need energy for all those extra 60 million people. Now you're going to have a real physical impact on where the wolf territory is. So it's just nothing good comes of it. Nothing good comes of it. And that's what I was trying to answer in the last question, is that we have to realize that overpopulation is a tyranny of its own kind. And to go after that tyranny is to go after the bad stuff. And so allowing it to grow is just ignoring that basic premise, if that makes any sense. I hope that makes sense. That you're saying, well, what if we do allow it? Well, I've already said it's tyrannical, so it's just going to be worse, in a cascading effect of worse, 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 worse. You're not going to get less pollution. You're not going to get less homelessness. You're not going to get all the things we think we're against. We're not, if we're not against population growth.
Yeah, nothing that I have seen in reading materials about the Century Initiative has led me to believe that there's any consideration for any of the negative aspects that you've mentioned, from problems with water supply to pollution.
There can't be. It's a delusion of limitlessness. Maybe that's a good title for a book. Delusion of limitlessness. I mean, we are delusional to think that I mean, even every time we put up a satellite or rocket, that takes fossil fuel and it puts carbon into the atmosphere. And nobody talks about that. They just think about the smoke and mirrors of, oh, what are we going to discover? And I'm not saying I'm not interested in what the Webb telescope has discovered, but nobody's talking about the ecological footprint of putting up those telescopes and what happens to the environment where we live. We can't live up there. That's another delusion. If we can't, what did Neil deGrasse Tyson say? Instead of spending all the money trying to terraform Mars, why don't we try to keep the terraform here right on Earth?
Yeah, very interesting. One brief observation, if I might go back to Richard van der Jaag's question. It has occurred to me, and I went through this back in the 60s and 70s when the United States was drawing a lot of well-educated people away from Canada, and we called it a brain drain. It seems to me that it is probably actually unethical for us to be bringing in highly trained people who have gotten their education in other countries and depriving their societies of the ability to provide the services those professionals would provide otherwise in those locations.
Well, yeah, and there are other issues at play. We have to look at the social political situation. I mean, for example, we're having a nurse shortage and a teacher shortage. And it isn't because we don't have enough people. It's because we have enough people they don't like being treated badly, paid badly. They don't want to be, they kind of like not to get shot in their jobs. So they don't go into those professions. And then we go, oh my goodness, let's bring in immigrants. I mean, in other words, they're not addressing what's behind the shortage. It's not usually bodies. It's usually bodies who are smart enough not to go into those professions.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yeah. My wife's a nurse, and there's a nursing shortage in Canada as well. And pretty simple here. Over 1/3 of the nurses quit within 5 years because of they feel abused.
Yeah, there you go.
We had an example, for example, during COVID that in Ontario, where I am, that the emergency responders were given a 5% wage increase because they were our heroes during COVID, but the nurses got 1%. Which is like really completely incomprehensible, and that kind of stuff is what drives people away.
Right.
And that it's the internal, in system dynamics terms, it's the endogenous variables. So in the Limits to Growth book, which is sort of the foundations, one of the foundation pieces to the Club of Rome, is that people tend to look at exogenous. So you look for solutions outside the system. It's a normal human response rather than looking internally, and the jargon is an endogenous variable, and that's what you were talking about. They're always more complicated and difficult and take longer, and so we avoid them because of that. Because I've been in politics, they just don't sell, because if you have a simple immediate solution, everybody's going to vote for you, and if you have a longer term complicated solution which will be sustainable, you don't get the vote. Anyway, so good conversation again. Our next is, sorry, Karen, you have a response?
No, I just wanted to say I'm glad to use those terms, and I'll try to adopt them. But what I'm trying to say is, life is more complicated. We need nuance, and politics is usually the opposite of that. It's usually what I call the bumper sticker view of the world, that you can get everything. And by the way, I do have to share my favorite one. It's my karma just ran over your dogma. I thought that would be okay. Next.
Great. Okay, we've got William Reese next, and on deck is David Pollock. Now, David Pollock is not here, so I am going to be David Pollock. So I will speak on his behalf. Okay, so William, you're on.
Well, thank you. Good to meet you at last, Karen. I've watched you perform many times over the past, so it's a great thing to see.
I'm a big fan of you as well.
Okay, thank you. David mentioned this Century Initiative in Canada that wants, and indeed the federal government has bought into it full hand, the 100 million Canadians by the end of the century. But few Americans seem aware that there's a similar movement in the States. There's even a book by, I think it's Iglesias, I can't remember the name, but anyway, they're pumping for 1 billion Americans by the end of the century. So we're keeping that 10-to-1 ratio between Canada and the United States. So this is a popular movement. Certainly the government of Canada has bought wholeheartedly into the Century Initiative. Which raises my real question was this one. Governments in the US and Canada are captive to the corporate sector. I mean, that's what Lakoff was all about.
Right.
Created a whole new framing of issues in terms of corporate values, growth, and so on and so forth. So that we have a situation where corporations are essentially dictating economic and environmental policy. Yes. In Canada, we've just had corporations, we're lending them $14 billion to build EV battery plants and car factories. Exactly. So but the problem is ordinary citizens buy into this. We're cheering from the bleachers. Yay, this is job creation, more growth, more money, more income. So the question is, we all know what should be done. You're telling us, but how do we break into the dominant cultural narrative? We're talking here about the story we tell ourselves about what is right and good, and replace it with a kind of participating consciousness with the natural world, which is the only thing that is going to turn this around.
Right.
We know what to do, but how do we change the cultural narrative across the board so that we don't buy into the nonsensical story that has propelled us into this situation?
Well, you're talking to someone who lives in a country where the more a certain political candidate is indicted for crimes against humanity, the more popular he gets. So I'm trying to figure that one out. I think, I don't know. I feel like I know that the Dalai Lama thought that this should be the century of restoration. And to me, it's been the century of surrealism because it makes no sense. I don't see rational having a room for anything. I think we need to have better strategy, better naming, better framing of everything. I do like Sam Harris, who dismisses everything. He says, I'm looking at the radical center. And when I hear the word radical center, I hear, oh, what? Tell me more. To me, the radical center, the radical part is we reject the corporate story. Not on the basis of we don't want our portfolios to grow, and not on the basis of that. We reject it because the earth is rejecting it. The earth is rejecting us. The earth is rejecting us with more pollution, more diseases, more everything that we don't want. And it's all due to this hooked on growth philosophy. And so we need to have a movement that we can all get behind that's it's political in its nature, but apolitical in its partyism. And we just say, who is the radical center that's going to be ecologically based? You're an ecologist. You teach ecology, and to me, your teaching should be started in kindergarten, and go all the way through, so that we have this ecological foundation, so that the public themselves go, "What are you thinking? This isn't sustainable," and they understand it. So many people. I mean, I'll tell family members that we're losing all these insects. They go, "Oh yeah, the cicadas are coming out. It's just horrible and creepy." I go, "No, it's wonderful and fantastic." So I can't even get people to embrace cicadas. How do I get them to embrace that we can't grow ad nauseum without hurting ourselves? And so it has to be a story of survival. I think where we've gone wrong in the environmental story is we've made it about frogs, and we've made it about crickets, and we've made it about wolves, and we haven't made it about people, because we can't survive in a world without a healthy biosphere. And somehow we've done the cognitive dissonance to think that we can. And corporations have our ear in every single ad you see. Try to get through a YouTube video on something good and not get all these ads on something you're supposed to buy that you don't need, because first they're going to tell you maybe you're a little tired, maybe you need this or whatever. And so we're just inundated with messages that are super funded. I mean, some of these billionaires who say they want to change the world, I'd say, how about money for advertising for a real healthy planet? I think that would be a wonderful thing to do. Wouldn't it be great to have ads on? You know, I'd like to see you come on my screen in the middle of a video on rock music history. And here's Bill Reese with your minute of ecology to tell you that. And I'm being funny, but I really mean that to be true. I would love to hear your message and messages, David Attenborough, and so many other of my heroes in conservation. I know you, but if I went down the street and say, I talked to William Reese today, isn't that wonderful? What would they say to me? Who's that? I'm sorry to say, I'm excited. And Leon Kalankowitz, my friend, would say, you talked to Bill Reese, oh, he's wonderful. But they wouldn't know who you are. And it's our fault for not elevating the great voices of our time, the E.O. Wilsons of our time, you know, and not giving them the microphone, and not being, because I don't think the message is that it's hard to hear it first, but at the end of the day, it's the only way out. So why not create more of an audience. Our competition is the billion-dollar advertising agencies. That's our competition. You know, I don't like pizza, but I can tell you exactly what time of day and what they put on a Papa John's pizza, and I don't even want to know that, because they have the microphone, they have the social media, they have all the tools we have of influencing. And the problem is with overpopulation, it just gets worse. It's so hard to reach people now that there are more people on the planet today than there were yesterday.
Yep. You see, the trouble is you and I and everyone else here are rational people. And the fact is that humans don't behave politically rationally. We are not primarily a rational species.
Absolutely.
In fact, I've recently written a couple of things about what I regard as human cognitive obsolescence.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, our brains have not evolved to cope with the complex environment we have created. We're still living with a primitive, simplistic, unidirectional mindset that is insanely inadequate and maladapted to the world we've created in just the last 200 years, something you've mentioned. So we will be selected out by an environment in revenge if we don't shape up.
Oh, and I don't think we're going to shape up, because I think that we're and that's where somebody said I was hopeful and optimistic, and I said, well, if you were here's what I try not to sound gloomy or live gloomy, but I think about I'm Jewish, and I think about my fellow Jews in Europe in 1935. The optimists didn't survive. The pessimists got the hell out of Germany. And I'm going, oh, that's kind of interesting. So if we're pessimistic about the future, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe people say, well, why? How come? If you say you're optimistic, they're just going to go about their merry way. They're going to go buy their new Mercedes, and they're going to go say, oh, I got the latest refrigerator, and I painted my ceilings, and life is good. If you say I'm pessimistic, Karen, why are you pessimistic? Because you're not listening to me. You're not listening to Bill. You're not listening to David Attenborough. You're not listening to the wise people of the world. And we can't go on if we don't listen. So sometimes I think we have to turn the whole thing on its head and just say things like, how about a book that says, we ain't going to make it? I think that would be a bestseller. I do. Instead, we try to be so optimistic. I'm not.
This is very entertaining. And I think it shows that we're not as intellectually advanced as Bill claims we are. I think everybody here is actually highly emotional. It's just that I think our emotions have tuned in to what's happening. So we're more sensitive emotionally to the reality of the death that's happening out there among all species, including the people, including the opioid addicts and the homelessness. And it's striking an emotional chord with us. So I don't know if we're any more rational. I just think our emotions are more finely tuned.
Gordon, that's exactly the point I was trying to make. I said we are not primarily a rational species. Yeah. By the way, the biggest addiction right now is on a drug called hopium.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I love that word. I used it in my talk.
I'm going to go to the next question, but a little story since we've opened the can of worms of World War II. I'm not Jewish, I'm Czech, but my family saw that the war was coming, my grandparents, and they got the hell out of there too. And they went to England during the war because they saw the war coming in the 30s as well.
Did they make it just in time for the Blitz?
They were in the countryside. They weren't silly enough to be in the city. They were in the country. They watched the planes fly overhead. Nothing happened to them, but
so aren't you glad they weren't optimists?
No, they were just realists. It's not optimist, or it's just this is reality, and there you go. Adapt, right?
Well, what I mean is, go ahead.
Our question here, I'm talking on behalf of David. The next on deck is Lynn. So Lynn, you're on deck. They're very similar questions, actually, and they're similar to what we heard earlier. So this is certainly a common theme. And what David asks is, while he agrees that stopping growth globally is necessary, what's going to happen to all the climate refugees that are going to be happening? Like, we know that the climate refugee crisis is happening right now and will get happening. So how do we deal with that issue while, you know, you've got what you're saying is also valid? What are we going to do?
Well, I think we have to, first of all, if you talk about realism, we have to realize that in a world of, I think we're at 421 parts per million right now. It's just going to keep getting worse. And in global situations, yet some of those places that are going to suffer the most still have very high birth rates, still are run by religious leadership that says, no, you can't have birth control and you can't, or we won't pay for it or whatever. So there are groups like Population Media Center working very hard on the ground in those countries to bring about lower numbers so that when climate hits the fan in their countries, there are less people who are suffer. I think those, I like to think in upstream terms. I just keep looking at a house, and when a house is full, yes, there are going to be people knocking on your doors at all time. I just don't think long term letting more in is going to be good for anybody. So climate is a real issue. A lot of people are denying that. Certainly not the island countries who've been. I've actually been at one of the climate conferences in Spain. They were well represented there. I think that the answer is to look deeper into what is happening. We're getting more deserts. We're getting more deserts. We're getting less water, and we keep growing our population by 81 million a year. So everything and every effort to keep our populations, decreasing is going to, in the long run, save more lives. And rather than say, come on in, which is not going to long-term help anybody, because we can't keep being, as my dear friend Roy Beck would say, being the release valve for the world. Not when 81 million are added every year. If you took in 1 million people, which is not sustainable, you're not really, now you've got 80 million who still need help. So in other words, it's not a solution in and of itself. And it's definitely a problem, though. I don't want to dismiss that it's a problem.
Thank you very much. Lynn, you're on. Lynn, this is going to be the last question, and then I'm going to wrap it up. For those of you who want to stick around, there is an informal conversation. If there's something on your heart, we will continue that with the unrecorded informal conversation after Lynn's final question. So Lynn, shoot.
Well, thank you, Karen, for at least addressing the population problem. It's something that's generally considered a non-starter in environmental circles, but it's still only half the issue. The other half is our level of consumption, of course, and whether the people are in Canada or whether the people are kept out of Canada, those people are still going to be on the planet and still going to be consuming goods. I think it's a hard sell in terms of Canada, which is the second largest nation in the world with an incredibly small population in comparison to most of the world, to say that we're overpopulated. That's a difficult argument to make. Personally, I don't want to see the population anywhere grow. I'd be happy if Canada's population decreased by half, but the reality is, if we have immigrants coming into Canada, in terms of the impact on the wolf population, it's probably going to be indirect, not direct in terms of infringing on their habitat. That's not to say that there won't be an impact on the wolf, but it would be, in my mind, indirect. And I just wondered what your thoughts were.
Well, I am using the wolf, especially in Canada's term, I agree with you, excuse me, as a metaphor more than that reality. I mean, in other words, certainly there's some room there. You have much more wiggle room than any other country on earth, and you have many more wolves than any country on earth. There's no question about that. When I did this program, I did it before hearing that, oh, Canada, well, let's kind of reconfigure what I'm talking about, but it is more of a metaphor. In talking about consumption, though, I think what's so important is to realize, to bring it down to basics and say, every human is going to need water, shelter, food, and energy. Okay. When our water supplies in the world, fresh water supplies, are going to go down no matter what we do because of climate change. We're going to have a drier, hotter climate. We're going to have less water. We need less people. And we can only manage that country by country. The hard sell in Canada, I understand that the optics aren't that good. But let me tell you that if people really understood the ecology of Canada and how small of a band you can actually live in versus your whole territory, it would make more sense. And we just have to make, people are just, it's just astonishing how ecologically unaware they are. It's build, 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 human, 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 more, more, more. And the truth is that if you have in our country 366 million Americans, and you say those 300, but they're going to recycle and they're going to go to the thrift store, and it's not going to make up for adding another 40 million people in the next 40 years or even less. Those 40 million are going to need the water we won't have. And so we've been focused too much, because it's politically less sensitive to focus on consumption than it is on just that we have too many people asking. And if you can really see that as a very humane thing, we are humanely going to address immigration, because more people will not make anyone in Canada's life better, not in the long run.
Yeah, but in your talk, you also emphasized the different parties in how they were seeing immigration. Are you suggesting that we vote based on immigration policies as a sole issue?
I would like it to be considered as an issue. I don't think any issue can handle being a sole issue. That I know people who would vote to have their house taken away just to make sure that abortion rights were not given to people. I mean, I do know people like that. So I think sole issues in any situation can be dangerous in and of themselves. But it certainly needs to be a consideration and not handled in a mean-spirited way. As Bill Reese said, we have to tell a better story, and our better story isn't being told. It's being told for us. That's one message I would like. We're allowing them to define us. We have to define ourselves. We are not mean. We are not hateful. We are not xenophobic. We are environmental realists who understand the impact of more people on our natural limited resources. And with that, I give you back to Gordon.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lynn. We're done now. I really appreciate all of your participation and hard-hitting questions. I just want to leave you with a good news story. I was walking my dog across the street. I live in an area south of Ottawa, which is mixed farmland and forest, quite a lot of forest where I am. And I heard the howling of the coyotes last night as we were walking and my dog picked up his ears and went, "Oh my gosh, what's that?" And just was on high alert. And we told the dog to stay with us because he would be dinner, right? And so somehow nature adapts and will do well. I agree with Karen. In effect, the wolf is the canary in the coal mine telling us about us and our issues. And that's really what this is about, is in our not having crash and burn, having scenario unfold before us. With that, I pass the torch to Ted to give me the final thank you and to then close us off. Ted, you're on.
Okay, Karen, that was wonderful. I mean, the dialogue has been fantastic, and we have to do it again. Most of the people around this round table have not been adequately programmed. The odd one actually doesn't believe in growth. They somehow escaped the patterning and the programming that we've been driving down their throats ever since they were born. And so I think what we looked at today was the different attitudes that could happen, where people might choose other options. And it's growth, basically it's growth in numbers, growth in consumption, growth in how many things I own, growth in how many people I rule over, growth. It is really the prime directive. And we've been doing a project called Well-Being for a while in the International Club of Rome to try and find ways to get people off that obsession. Do we have answers? No. Do we have questions? Yes, we do. And almost all of them were covered very well today. So again, we thank you very much for coming. And now it's the time we give you the commercial. It costs to put this on to get the quality of people and presentations. And so we definitely ask everyone to belong to the Canadian Association. You can go to http://canadiancorps.com. See our website. There's wonderful stuff on there. Art just made it even better as of today. I saw it this afternoon, and it's even more effective than it was before. And we have scheduled presentations, hopefully nearing this caliber for the next 6 months, pretty well lined up. So again, thank you ever so much for coming. And we'd ask everybody to subscribe if you wish to see it on YouTube, if you want to share it with anyone. Virtually all of our presentations are available on our website. And please just subscribe when you do so. It makes it easier for us to keep this going. So thank you again. And we can now start talking to each other without any recording.